Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi on what is, for me, a very rainy Saturday morning. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be doing our HAPS interviews this morning and every Saturday in May. So we are going to get started. First, we have Nagme. Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited.
Could you open by just explaining who you are and where you are a student?
Yes, so my name is Nagme. I'm Iranian, but I moved in Italy, and I'm doing my Ph.D. at University of Venice, in Archaeology of Iran, and my interests are about the arrowheads, the Iranian plateau. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we are here to find out more about that. And for people who are watching, if you're unfamiliar with how this works, please put any questions you have for Nagme in the chat. We will be getting to those in the last portion of her interview. And it's going to be interesting. I love hearing about everyone's research. So Nagme, would you please just briefly explain your personal research interests?
My personal research interest is most focused on the artifacts. I mean, I like small things, and to study them very by detailed approaches and mixing the approaches, and to find out the bigger matters behind them, and the makers and the users, the people behind that are small objects, because I think sometimes we forgot about the small things. So they are very important. So
they really are. And I think you're right. That's something that happens in archaeology a lot. People get very excited about the big statues and the palaces, and actually the small things from people's lives can tell us an awful lot about what happened in the past. So what are your plans for the summer then, and how would HAPS be able to help you with those?
My research about the arrowheads, metal arrowheads found in the Iranian plateau and adjacent regions from the 6th century BC to the 7th century BC. So it's a big geographical and chronological framework. And I use multidisciplinary approaches, such as a statistical approach and archaeometry, and using cultural evolution approach as a theoretical method to go on with my work. And I need to collect a lot of data, because to be able to understand very well the situation of these small objects in that big geographical and chronological framework, I need a lot of data, and I need to travel. So this fund can help me to realize and to gather all the data I needed to be able to insert them to my database and start my analysis on them. Sorry, I can't hear you.
No, sorry. I muted myself so that I wouldn't disturb you talking, and then I completely forgot. The arrowheads were originally found, you said, on the Iranian plateau. Where are they now? Are they still in Iran, or have they been transported across the world?
It depends. So I searched a lot to propose my project to the university, and there are a lot of sites. Actually, there are a lot. I prepared the map with all the points of the sites, and it's a work and process. I'm updating it every time I read the article. For regarding the past excavation, there are many arrowheads in other countries, in Europe or in US, such as the Louvre, British Museum, or Metropolitan Museum, or Oriental Institute of Chicago. But as the laws regarding cultural heritage change, so now the arrowheads from the recent excavations, are in that countries where the site is. So for my master degree, I studied a little bit of arrowheads. So I traveled to France, I traveled to Iran, and studied a small collection. And for now, I aim to do it bigger and to understand the bigger matters behind these artifacts. So I start to travel a little bit in this period, but I need to focus to collect this data during the summer and finish like 90% of this process before September.
I see. Thank you very much. Why arrowheads? What got you interested in those in particular?
Well, at the first, where I work in the mission in Iran, where I work, we found arrowheads, and they needed somebody to study them. So every time it begins like this. So I look at them and say, okay, let's see what's behind these things. But seriously, they have been found in many sites and in many quantity. And nobody have a great interest on these objects. So the first things that I discussed in my master degree for my supervisor, that it's gonna be great if I can give the extra value to these objects as a dating objects, because we have a lot of them, and we usually use pottery and other materials to date the layers and to use for the stratigraphy dating. But they are great, because metal arrowheads, the shape of the metal arrowheads are very clear. The differences is very obvious. So there is it's more clear to understand them. It's more easier, but we don't have a big scale of their change during the time and across the different regions. So by understanding them as archaeologists, we can have a great help to dating the layers during the excavation. On the other hand, we can understand the communication behind these arrowheads. There were a lot of mercenaries during the different times in empires, coming from different regions to fighting for other armies. But then one person come from a region to another region brings a lot of things with themselves. So it's about the culture, it's about the changing, to pass the information, to pass the technology, and the things like this.
So they can be used for like both as a device for dating archaeological layers, but also to show cultural transmission?
Yes, of course. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent, thank you. Audience, if you have questions for Naghmeh, we do have her for another 15 minutes or so. So definitely get your questions in the side chat and I will ask them. Until then, I'm just going to keep asking you questions because I find this very interesting. So, sorry, I have a small child currently being shepherded out of the study by his father. When we're looking then at these arrowheads, what kinds of archaeological contexts are they found in? Are they scattered across the site, or are they in caches or in like manufacturing centers?
They have been found in different contexts that actually, for me, it's very important to consider these because of the value of the context that passed to the object. They have been found in military contexts, if we want to say, battlefields, treasury, like storage for the military objects together. They have been found many in funerary contexts, so with the people buried, the soldiers especially. or in some regions that it gives a great value for the men to be buried with the military objects. And another context that they have been found a lot, there are votive contexts. So it's like site in Tajikistan, the Tahta Sangin, they have been found 3,000 arrowheads together in the votive in the temple. So, but these contexts create a different kind of, to say, the stratigraphic value for dating, because they're not primary, maybe they're secondary. So I kind of created different levels of this context for my work. So the primary and then going to burial and votive context. So the most important ones are the context that they like a battlefield or storage or yeah, like this.
How can you go about determining whether something is a primary, a secondary, or tertiary context? Is that a very difficult thing to do, or is it maybe more intuitive than people might think?
I mean, the primary, secondary that I said I meant by the dating, the value dating of like a votive context is not very, very reliable for my work because it could, because there's no stratigraphic layer of the other objects together with these objects. So the accumulation of 3,000 arrowheads together from different types. I don't have other things to compare and decide, okay, the date for this arrowhead is like this. So this is the thing. I usually read, I have to read, I read a lot the archaeological reports, so to understand what the directors of the mission decide about these contexts. But as I said, for example, the votive context that we find a lot, they have been found a lot, that they are not very reliable.
Thank you very much. And this is maybe a little bit off topic. How do you identify a battlefield? Is there a lot on the surface that you can see and think, oh, this is a site that we need to dig? Or is it more chance?
Based on the things that I read, there are not too much battlefield context. There are some, for example, northwest of Iran, going toward Turkey. There have been sites like a defensive wall, and there were like a lot of military equipment on both sides, and but they had a lot of historical information that in this area there was a battle, so there was a war, so they interpreted it as a battlefield. But for a store kind of context, it's very difficult. You're right to identify the battlefield as imagine a battlefield. Or another site that in the Susa they found a lot of arrowheads going inside the wall and a lot of burning areas. But there are different, the type of the arrowheads inside and outside the wall are different completely.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so you can sometimes, it's very risky, it's very kind of difficult job to do, but sometimes the evidence are great. I mean, they just like a gift to the study.
Do you know how many arrowheads, or do you like have an idea of how many arrowheads you'll end up with in your database when you're finished?
I gathered like 600 till now, and I hope they will come to more than 2,000.
Wow.
Because only the Persepolis treasury, they have been found, they like 4,000 arrowheads. But they are in different museums, so this is a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some, they are in Iran, they are out of Iran, so it's kind of difficult to gather all the information. I will study. I like to highlight this fact that I will study some of the arrowheads by myself
Mhm.
and measure them and photograph them because I created a database to different kind of measurements and description. There are 24 characters defined for each of the arrowheads, and I use it as a solid base for the study. But I can't go to every each site and study all the arrowheads. So I will create a different level of the data based on the reliability of the information, and then attribute for example, those one published and I can't have access, attribute them to those one that I study by confronting their typology, their context, and the kind of all overview of information around it.
So, when you've been trying to gather this data, has it been difficult to get access through museums or through archives to the actual arrowheads, or have you been relatively successful with that?
Well, until now, I didn't have big problems. I mean, it usually is bureaucratic work. It needs time. It needs patience. You have to be patient by these things, but no big problem. I I'm so happy that Tina I could do these things. I'm traveling a lot, and but it's good.
That's wonderful. So after you finished your data collection, what would the next step be for your PhD?
So when the data are collected, I will use a statistical approach to that use sensitive methods to recognize and trace the diagnostic traits of the arrowheads. Basically, three approaches: cluster analysis for creating the typology, chronotypology, component principal component analysis, and multi-correspondent analysis for continuous and categoric characters of the arrowheads. And also, when is possible, archaeometry analysis, because it's kind of more difficult to arrange this kind of analysis. To understand the chemical composition and microstructure of the arrowheads, also to add it to the other characters of arrowheads, and the results will be. I like to study the results in the light of course, archaeological and historical information, and cultural evolutionary approach to understand the first how the arrowheads change, what are the period of stability and the change, what are the reasons, and in the bigger scale to understand the cultural transmission in this area. Um, so these are the, I hope I can.
Thank you. We have a super chat from Native Atheist who sends us $20 and says, "Thank you for this talk." You are very welcome. Thank you so much for your donation and for your attention. We do have a question from the audience. Was there a particular deity of war that the votive arrowheads were dedicated to? Do you know?
Can you explain a little bit? Sorry, I didn't
No,
understand.
of course. You said some of the arrowheads were found in a votive context. Do you know what deity they were dedicated to? What god or goddess?
Uh, the one that I mentioned, that the 3,000 big number, it's Temple of Oxus. So I'm not very good in the religious studies, sorry,
No?
but I'm more focused more on materials. Yeah, but it was Temples of Oxus in the northeast of Tajikistan, that near to Ay Khanum site, and it was interpreted as as a temple for the military persons. So yeah, I don't know exactly the detail about it.
No,
That's
that's fine. Thank you very much. A lot of audience questions we get are people just being curious, and we don't expect that our interviewees will be able to answer every question. That's absolutely not a problem. So I actually do not have any more questions for you, and we don't have any more from the audience. Was there anything that you wanted to add before we said goodbye?
Oh, no, thank you very much. I'm very happy to find out about your program. It's great. I'd like your approach to be online and do it with other people, because I have to admit that the archaeologists are very close and we need to open up to the public. So it's very great. Thank you very
Oh, no,
much.
it's my absolute pleasure, and thank you for being willing to come and talk about your research. I know it can be intimidating. You've done an excellent job, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Have a lovely day.
You too. Goodbye.
Bye. That was Naghmeh. She is researching Iranian arrowheads, or arrowheads found on the Iranian plateau. And as a reminder for those who are new to HAPS, because we started a little late, so I actually didn't manage to do my usual explanation and introduction. HAPS is the nonprofit that I run. It stands for Humans Against Poor Scholarship. And our intention is to give research grants to PhD students who are working on some aspect of the ancient Near East. And that includes, like Naghmeh, archaeologists, Assyriologists, Hebrew Bible scholars, art historians, really anyone who researches that area of the world in what we would call an ancient time frame. And the way that HAPS works is that applicants send in their applications. I go through them and draw up a shortlist along with the board members, kind of removing people who are a little bit outside of the field. And then we schedule everybody for an online interview, which is what we're doing today. One of the requirements is that applicants come and they explain their research to you, to a general audience of interested non-specialists, because we think it's very important that academics learn how to explain their research to people who are not also academics. And because you clearly are interested in the ancient world and in ancient history, or you would not be here. So our applicants come, they do an interview, they answer any audience questions. And then after all of the interviews are concluded, everybody who has donated to HAPS is given the opportunity to vote for the students, for the research that they would most like to see funded for the summer. We have three, I believe, nearly enough money for four grants of $2,000 each. To cover or help cover research costs during the summer months. And this money can go towards conference expenses, or like Naghmeh, traveling to do research, archaeological dig expenses, but also just kind of general living while you are writing and while you are researching, because a lot of, especially North American institutions, do not give PhD students the, well, they don't give you enough money, to be very blunt, and they don't pay you over the summer months. So often you are left with a financial gap in between the semesters. And if especially you have children, or you are unable to otherwise have employment outside of your studies, it can be very difficult to find the funding for that. So we don't put any restrictions on what our funding can be used for. If you're a student, if you are studying the ancient Near East and you need funding for the summer, you are welcome to apply to HAPS. So that's a very long-winded way of saying everyone who donates is able to then help choose what students receive the funding. So if you have donated, thank you very much. You will receive an email from me after all of our interviews are concluded on the 29th of May, I believe. If you have not donated and you would like to, any donation made before the 29th of May will be eligible for the voting process. You can donate. There's a text number going across the bottom of your screen. There is also a web address if you prefer to donate online. We are an official federally recognized nonprofit. So if you are in the US, you can use this as a tax write-off, which is a good thing. I think it's a great selling point for donating to us. So go ahead and donate, and we will send you an email in a couple of weeks with information about how you can register. Well, yes, how you can register to vote. And yeah, that's HAPS. If you have questions about the program in general, please put them in the comments if you're watching this afterwards, or in the side chat if you are watching live, and I will do my best to answer them all. We're being asked if Naghmeh is on social media. I do not know. I will ask her. And if she is, I will ask all of our all of our applicants. If they are, I will put their social media tags in the description to this video, so you will be able to track them down after the interview process is completed. We have approximately 4 minutes before we start our next interview. Does anyone watching have any questions? I'm assuming not, but if you do, put them in and I will do my best. Interviews are running every Saturday in May, and the final ones will be on the 29th on a Sunday. So we have a lot to get through. It is not as many as last year. I think last year we had 50 odd to go through. But I think we are going to be doing well when we get through everybody. Sorry, I am just checking something. And then I am going to bring in our next applicant, and my keyboard appears to have died, which is always an exciting thing. You wouldn't all be here if it wasn't for the technical ineptitude of myself. So thank you all for your patience. And looking at the time, we are about ready for our next person. So I am going to bring Priscilla into the stream so we can ask her about her research. Good morning, Priscilla. Are you here?
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you.
I'm very well, thank you. You are live on YouTube, just so you know. I don't want anyone to be surprised. So we will just dive right into it. Would you mind please introducing yourself and telling us where you're a student?
Right. So my name is Priscila Dantas de Moraes. I'm a first-year Ph.D. student in the History of Art and Visual Studies department at Cornell University.
Thank you very much. And what are your personal research interests?
So right now, I'm very interested in studying the art and architecture of places of worship in the Near East region during late antiquity and early Byzantine period. That would be around 3rd century CE until 8th century CE. I'm interested in how architecture can be connected to cosmology, specific cosmologies of that time, mostly related to Christianity and Judaism.
Thank you very much. Are you looking at a particular site or just as much information as you can find?
For now, what we're trying to do is to try to filter a little bit more what sites interest me, me and my advisor. And I'm mostly thinking about nowadays Israel and Syria.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. What are your plans for the summer then, and how can HAPS help you?
Yeah, my plans for the summer, I've been accepted to an excavation project led by University of North Carolina, led by Professor Alexander Eger, that will explore the region of Caesarea Maritima in nowadays Israel. And the project is mostly, also we will have classes about archaeological practices and how to deal with objects and things like that. And I am very excited to take part of it because the project is focused on the early Islamic period, the period that is very connected to what I'm studying. And the aim of this project is to see how the city changed from classical times until this early Islamic period. So Caesarea was one of the places that I studied during my master's. My master's was about late Antique and early Byzantine synagogues. And Caesarea was one of the cities that I study, and it's a city that is very relevant to my research because we have churches there, latent churches and synagogues as well. And yes, and since the project is a paid one, I am hoping that HAPS could maybe help me to fund this amazing project.
It sounds like a fantastic and very appropriate opportunity for you. It sounds like it really aligns with what you're looking at. So looking at cosmology and architecture, then how can you kind of give us a bit more information about how that relationship works?
Yeah, so for example, in synagogues, you can see certain cosmologies related to Jewish traditions. A cosmology here I understand as studying the creation myths and the nature of the universe, how it works itself. So synagogues are very interesting monuments to study that, because we can see them for those types of traditions reflected on, for example, mosaic floors, the way that the architectural plan is made. And so, for example, one of the most inspiring examples, and the ones that I studied during my master's, are the mosaic floors, where you find the zodiac wheel, for example, with biblical scenes and scenes of the Old Testament, of the creation myths and things like that. And you can also see that in churches, for example, the marble being connected to heaven, and gold being connected also to the figure of Christ. Those mostly on mosaics that you can see on the upper part is for the Byzantine period I'm referring to. So yeah.
Do you see a lot of changes over time, or does this practice remain relatively stable?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No. Do you see a lot of changes over time in how the architecture is used to depict these kinds of things, or does it stay relatively stable throughout the periods you're looking at?
I do see a change, especially when it comes to churches, because throughout the Byzantine period, we see that we had, during late antiquity, a lot of influence from Greco-Roman art for synagogues and for churches as well. And as the time passes, we see a shift when it comes to the art inside those places. For example, in churches, we see a lot more the use of different materials and different decorations. So, for example, the mosaics on the upper part of the ceiling, and different types of materials as well. For synagogues, for example, we don't have much evidence of early synagogues, to be honest. We only it really begins with the late antique and early Byzantine period. So I'm not a specialist in medieval synagogues and things like that, but I can imagine that that had a shift as well.
Thank you. And kind of same question, but looking at the geographical spread, is this a very regional practice, or do we see similarities across the areas?
You mean Israel? And
yeah, so do you find in say maybe in the south there's one way of doing things and it looks different in the north, or is it relatively homogeneous?
Oh yes, to be honest, the synagogues that I've analyzed, they are very, very similar. Because also, of course, I was trying to identify patterns, so I took examples that are very similar. But the iconography of the mosaics, for example, is quite similar, because it was very influenced again by the Greco-Roman tradition, mosaic tradition. So they do share a lot of similarities, and in terms of architectural plan as well. The presence of a naps, some sort of narthex, it's very identifiable, and the use of materials as well, the tessera that makes the mosaics, and sometimes marble. Yeah, they do share a lot of similarities, and you can find synagogues. In this case, I'm talking about synagogues. You can find synagogues that share a lot of similarities, north, center, and south.
Thank you very much. What got you interested in this particular area of research?
Yeah, so that's a funny story. When I was an undergraduate student, actually, I was thinking about specializing in history of Brazil. I'm Brazilian, by the way. History of Brazil, but then I took a very interesting seminar about the archaeology of the Near East region, where they mentioned mosaic art, and we dealt with architecture as well, with many types of materials related to the Near East during late antiquity. And I've kind of I don't know, fell in love with the period itself, because late antiquity is a very important period, formation and consolidation of different types of religion, Judaism, Christianity, and after that Islam a little bit later. So I kind of fell in love with this period and what it represents to humanity itself and the region very at that time. When I was an undergrad student, not as explored as maybe as it is today. And I thought that could be a nice opportunity to maybe study that.
Wonderful, thank you. When you have kind of finished your summer of research, what are your plans after that?
My plans, so I actually intend to work during the summer, just to give you some context, to work with Professor Eager in the excavation, but I also intend to do some things independently. Geographical analysis, some things that are important to my research as well, because I also study, for example, things related to light and illumination, how those influenced architecture or the construction of places of worship, things like that. I also intend to do that. So after I finish this and the summer project with Professor Eager and this independent studies that I'll do also in Israel during this period, I intend to write an article, maybe.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
Looking at light in the construction of religious space,
and also at the geographical space itself, how that influenced maybe the architecture of places of worship and things that I actually need to see in person, and because there aren't any studies of that I'm aware of. So.
That's very interesting. I feel like that's something that maybe a lot of people either don't consider or aren't aware of, something that maybe they should be considering when they're looking at architectural spaces.
Yes, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yes, because this was in Greco-Roman culture, this was already very important, but in the late antique period and early Byzantine, and with synagogues and churches, you do see the importance of where the buildings are oriented to, for example, how light, because light itself had a very important role in Christianity. For example, in churches, Christ was also always metaphorically related to light, to light of the world, and etc. So, and you see that the early churches had they kind of played with this concept in early Byzantine churches, and I'm very interested in those type of phenomenology process.
Thank you. And do you? I know it's difficult to say because you haven't been able to go and physically do the level of research you want to. Do you have a feeling that there will be maybe trends in the geographical area that these places are put in, or like on top of mountains or down in valleys or by water maybe, or is it not sure?
I'm not sure. I do know that mountains had a very important role in Jewish tradition. Overall, in general, I know that some sacred places are located next to mountains. For example, and also for Samaritan synagogues, they were very connected to Mount Gerizim and things like that. So I do know that for synagogues, at least, there might be a connection existing. I don't know for church. I still have to look into that because I've never been there. So.
Oh no, and I mentioned this to the previous interviewee. A lot of these questions are very speculative. We don't expect you to know the answer to everything. Like, you're at the beginning of your career. This is like stuff that you're working on and have not like completely figured out yet. So please don't. I tell the audience I don't know the answer to things literally all the time, so they're very used to it. And on that note, audience, if you do have questions for Priscilla, please do put them in the chat, because we have a few minutes left with her, and then we're going to let her go and get on with the rest of her day. Are you then, when you, and again, this is like way in the future, when you finish your PhD, do you have a rough idea of what you would like to do?
I do actually. I would like to be a professor, but I would like to do research as well.
Mhm.
So I would like to have a job, maybe in a good university or a good place where I can do. I'll have time to do some research as well.
Mhm.
So
Would you like to carry on the research that you're starting with your PhD, or are there different directions that you think you'd like to explore when you have the time?
sorry.
Would you like to carry on the research that you've started, or would you like to see if there are different directions that are interesting to you as well?
I would like to stick to this idea of this research idea of trying to connect cosmology to the architecture of sacred places of worship
Mhm.
in Near East, because I think that there's a bunch of material that was not explored yet. That could, and I'm also fascinated by by this. So I'll probably work with that if I work with research.
That's the best way to do it. Find the thing that fascinates you. Um, so I actually am. We're very early, but you've answered all of the questions that I have. Was there anything that you wanted to explore more or tell the audience about before I let you go?
As I said, I am very interested in phenomenology and light and sound as well. I guess I didn't mention sound. I'm fascinated by the work of Bisera Pincheva. She's a scholar from Stanford studying, for example, sound, and she did an amazing essay and research on Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So I feel like my work is also influenced by those types of research. So
Mhm.
I'm very interested in exploring the five senses and how this also relates to cosmology and to the architecture of a sacred place, because sacred places they are places where you're supposed to feel different and
Mhm.
feel connected to something bigger. Um,
Yeah.
I quote mark here because this depends on the religion or culture you were talking about. But those are places where you're meant to feel special. So not only visually, but also when it comes to sound, to touch, to those types of interaction. I'm very interested in.
So that is interesting, and sound is actually not something that I hear discussed a lot in terms of archaeology and ancient spaces. I assume because so much of it is very difficult, maybe to really get at when you're looking at archaeological ground plans rather than existing structures. How do you go about looking at sound with the buildings that you're considering?
So, for example, it's easier when you have the building, of course, standing there as Hagia Sophia is, for example, it still exists. So, what you can do if you have, as she had, the material evidence, so the way the way the monks used to sing, and of course, she did a multidisciplinary work with people from computer science that could help her with the edition, because to give you some context, what she did was she reproduced what monks used to sing in Hagia Sophia. Monks or religious people used to sing in Hagia Sophia again. So she took the material evidence, the textual evidence that they had, and material evidence, and they joined this with the help of people from the STEAM sciences and things like that.
Mhm.
So it's easier when you have, for example, textual evidence that attests to how, in that case, specific case, because we're talking about songs, how people used to sing and how this, because there is in that case material evidence for textual evidence for that. But when you don't have that, still you can try to analyze, for example, how voice, because it's the sound, it how do you say that, it reflects difference in certain types of materials. So for example, if it's marble, if the place is made with marble, your voice is going to sound different. If it's a large place, a closed place, your voice is going to sound powerful or not powerful, or supernatural, let's put it like,
Mhm.
or not, or influential, or And this is something that you can see, for example, it was very studied for Greek theaters, for example, this idea of sound, the propagation of sound, and how that influences your audience or the people that are standing there on that specific building. So if you do have the remains of the architectural remains, even if you don't have the place itself, but you have some remains, you can analyze the material and see how perhaps sound was propagated there, or what kind of influence might have been. Might have been.
That's really fascinating. And it hadn't occurred to me that you don't necessarily need the whole space if you know what it was made of and you have some samples. That's very interesting.
Yes.
This is possibly an impossible question to answer. Do you think that materials were chosen? So we know that when building, people choose materials based on the strength and also how it looks visually, especially for things like religious structures. Do you think that's do you think that the sound played into that choice at all, or do you think this is maybe more of a subconscious experience?
I do think that you're talking about materials related to the choice. Yes, I do think that it played a role, a very important. One scholar, I guess, that does a nice job when it comes to materiality, Fabio Berry, also from Stanford. He shows how materiality plays a very important role. The choice of materials play an essential role, not only in classical times, for Greco-Roman period, but after that as well. So, and this is also connected to sound. As I said, for example, in Hagia Sophia, these studies were also, Bisera Pencheva also made this type of study, where she analyzed how sound was propagated in Hagia Sophia, and how this was actually thought in advance by people that the architects and people that built Hagia Sophia. It's a very interesting study and very influential to me, to my work.
That sounds very, very interesting. Sorry, I'm going to turn my phone off. So I'm an Assyriologist and look at Mesopotamian culture. And some of the things that you see there are materials having almost like metaphysical properties, like they're associated with like gods and attributes. Do you see similar associations influencing material choice in late antiquity and Byzantine period buildings?
I do. So one good example is marble and gold. Gold, for example, was very, very, very associated with the idea in antiquity of sun god, and in the late antique and early Byzantine period in churches with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So
in Byzantine period, you see the mosaic ceiling with usually gold. You can, if you go to Italy and get into a church, the early Byzantine or Byzantine church, if it has a mosaic ceiling, probably it's going to be gold, because gold is very much associated with Christ. Marble was associated with water. Water is very important for Jewish tradition, the idea of God separating the water. And also for Judeo-Christian tradition. And so marble was very used in, marble columns were very used in early Byzantine churches. So also glass, because in that case, it reflected light. The idea of light was very present. So yes, those were very, very, I believe, conscious decisions when it comes to choosing materials.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time and for being willing to come online and explain your research. I know it can be quite intimidating. You have done a wonderful job, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. Have a lovely afternoon, I suppose. And I'll be in touch in about a month.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, you too.
Thank you, Priscilla. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, everyone, that was Priscilla. She is working on late antiquity, early Byzantine synagogues and churches. And I found that fascinating. I never really considered the sensory experience of things like marble. I am going to put a little holding screen up while we wait for our next person, but we should be back within about 5 or 10 minutes. Hello again, everybody. We are back. We are just going to bring in Lavinia in 1 second. You will see that I have acquired a baby. For those of you who are unaware, I have almost 1-year-old twins who will probably be popping in and out of the various interviews we have scheduled, because when they wake up, they demand milk, or there will be lots and lots of screaming. So bear with me. He's generally a good baby, but who knows how this is going to go. So we have Lavinia. Good morning, Lavinia. How are you?
Good morning. Fine, thanks. And you?
Very well. Thank you so much for joining me. Could you just introduce yourself and tell everybody where you are a student?
Yes, of course. I'm Lavinia Giorgi. I'm a PhD student at Sapienza University of Rome. I'm studying Mycenaean philology and Aegean archaeology. And my PhD research focuses on the reconstruction of the bronze production chain in the Mycenaean centers through the analysis of the linear B tablets and the integration and by combining data with those come from the other written sources, namely the Hittite texts, Ugaritic documents, and Elamarna letters. And because of the materiality of the object of my study, the bronze, and copper and tin, that are the main components of the alloy, the bronze alloy, I would like to take in account also the material evidence, the archaeological evidence, to confirm or not the model that I would like to reconstruct at the end of my PhD research. And okay.
No, I was just going to say thank you. That's an incredibly full answer. And I love getting people who deal with trade and with production, because it's completely the other end of the spectrum from what I have researched. And I find it very, very interesting, because it has an impact on so many different areas of the ancient world. And I think that's something that people often don't realize, is how very important this kind of research is. So you mentioned that you look at the linear B evidence. What kinds of texts are these?
The linear B texts are administrative texts, such as our receipt in some way, and they are written on clay tablets, which can be either long and thin, and or like a page of a book, or of like
a larger rectangle.
Yes, exactly. So bigger than the others, and they deal with economic, pretty much with economic topics, such as agriculture, or metal produced, or how to say, the livestock, for example. Others focused on the society. So are, for example, lists of people probably involved by the palaces that were the main centers of the Mycenaean kingdoms, that are they were political, economic, and probably religious centers, which centralized the sources and in part and control the most important sources for the Mycenaean economy and society.
Thank you. So, what do you plan on doing this summer, and how would HAPS be able to help you?
This summer, I would like to focus my research on the Hittite texts, because for my PhD, as I told you before, I would like to compare the information from the linear B tablets with with the information from Hittite texts, for example. And so I would like to study and analyze the the Hittite texts in order to identify some information which can help to fill the gaps that I noticed already in the bronze production chain that I could reconstruct by analyzing the linear B tablets. And to do so, I would like to try to reconstruct the bronze production chain for the Hittite centers, especially for Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite kingdom, and also to observe where the bronze objects or copper and tin objects were used in the Hittite world, if we can say like this, because it one of the aspects that are not that we cannot see we cannot know from the linear B tablets and for the Mycenaean world in general.
Thank you. When you're looking then at the Mycenaean line of production, how many different cultures are involved in bringing all of the materials together to make bronze in one place? Are the Mycenaeans able to provide everything themselves, or are they having to trade with a variety of other people to get the materials they need?
They had to trade with other people because with other culture in general, because to make bronze, copper and tin need, and copper and tin are not copper and tin minings are not in Greece. Small deposits of copper. We can find small deposits of copper in Greece, not at all of tin, and so. But even the copper minings are and were not enough to provide the copper that needed in the late Bronze Age, late Aegean Bronze Age. And so Mycenaeans had to trade with other people, especially the east part of the Mediterranean, because copper, the most important source of copper during the late Bronze Age, so during the second half of the second millennium BC, was Cyprus, which provided copper for all the Eastern Mediterranean, and tin, while tin came from mostly from the Central Asia, especially from Afghanistan. The Mycenaeans had to trade with, for example, the Syrian coasts and with Ugarit, for example, in order to provide tin. And this is one of the reasons why I would like to examine also the Ugaritic texts, because they can help to better know the tin trade in which Mycenaeans were inserted in some way.
And was this bronze made for Mycenaean consumption, or was it then exported as a finished product?
They mostly used for themselves, because they used to make, especially to make weapons, and even from the iconography, we know that Mycenaeans were a warrior society. So and weapons are one of the most attested objects in the tablets, in the linear B tablets. So and they used for themselves. And another kind of object that they produced were vessels. Especially the vessels used in the palace. So they were royal vessels, and so again, use for internal use of bronze objects. The idea is that Mycenaeans imported copper and tin to make bronze in order to produce the objects for themselves. So for an internal production of bronze objects, and they can give in exchange other kind of materials and objects, such as oil, perfumed oils, and textiles, which are mentioned and attested in the linear B tablets again, and even in the production chain, especially for textiles in general.
When you're looking then, bless you, at the linear B materials, does it seem as though the production of bronze and its subsequent use in Mycenaean culture was heavily regulated by the elites, or is this something that was maybe more people had access to than we might expect?
What we know from the linear B tablets is what the palaces were interested to. So we know how what the palaces control and what kind of materials. For the bronze, we can hypothesize that the palace gave the bronze or the raw materials in general, so copper and tin or bronze, to the smiths in order to produce objects that can, in some way, they can return they had to return to the palace. We don't know for whom, because it is not written in the tablets, unfortunately, and we can hypothesize that the weapons were some kind of weapons were for the elite, of course, and for example, the royal vessels, of course, were for the royal family, or also vessels that were used for religious purposes. We can say that were not for the elite, but for the maybe religious, the sanctuaries, for example, but other weapons could be also for soldiers, common soldiers. So it is not clear from the tablets for whom were some kind of objects.
I see. Thank you.
Just deduce that.
Yeah, and so I think this is a truth for anyone who works with ancient texts. There is always information missing, and information that we really wish we had. If you could pick one thing that you wish people had recorded, what would that be?
Well, for my topic, the topic that I'm studying, I really would like to that the scribes could have written maybe the from where they can or they took the raw materials, because it's something that is it could be very important to understand the circulation of bronze, copper, and tin, which were the some of the most important sources of late Bronze Age, and they can clarify probably this can clarify the trade network in general of the not only the Eastern Mediterranean, but probably the Mediterranean, the whole Mediterranean.
Thank you very much. And I have another trade-related question. Was the trade then being carried out directly by the palace, or were they kind of commissioning private traders to go and bring these materials back for them?
We don't know actually. We can because the linear B tablets don't say anything about almost anything about trade. So we can just some scholars hypothesize that the fact that the tablets don't say anything about trade would be an evidence of the fact that the palaces don't care about trade, and then trade was just in the hand of the private merchants. But it is possible also that this is a lack of information and of the evidence that we have. So it is possible that the tablets that deal with the trade are missing because they were not found, or because they were destroyed in some way in some time, and and because it is not since the important materials such as copper, tin, and bronze can come from, or had to come from, had to be imported. It is difficult to, for me, actually, to think that the palaces didn't care about this, how to import these materials. So in some way, or for me, they control the way and how control the importation of these the import of these materials.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, and I know you kind of answered this, but maybe just for clarification for the audience, you mentioned that this summer you're going to be looking at the Hittite evidence to try and fill in some of the gaps you have for the Mycenaean. What information are you hoping to find in the Hittite materials?
For example, how or the how some kind of objects were used. For example, Hittite texts are most of the Hittite texts deal with the religious aspects, the religious aspects. So they are religious. They are like cult inventories, for example, or texts about festivities. During the feasts, many metal objects were used, such as vessels, such as offering for the gods. So I would like to, for example, to observe if if some objects we can compare. So, for example, same kind of vessels or same kind of tools which are mentioned in the Hittite texts, as well as both in the Hittite texts and the Linear B tablets. If there are these matches. So in this way, we can, or I can hypothesize that also some objects attested in the Linear B tablets were used in the same way or in a similar way, because Linear B tablets don't say anything about how these objects were used.
Thank you. When you're doing that kind of cross-cultural work, how far can you draw similarities or draw conclusions from one culture about how another may have used the same kinds of objects? Can you look at it and say this is definitely, they've got the same objects, they're probably using them in the same way? Or is it more of a like a hypothesis that you may not be 100% sure on, but it's kind of better than not knowing anything at all?
Yes, it is in the comparative method is or approach based on the in my view, in my opinion, is based on the fact that we can compare. We cannot say that there are, for example, they are the same objects that can use in different cultures, in different, for example, even in different periods and different places, of course. But we can compare the trend that these objects, for example, we are talking about objects, so use the objects like an example. The same kind of objects was used in different cultures, in different places, and because human beings think and thought in a similar way, we can say. So it is possible that the same trend and the same develop of developing of some processes were the same. So of course we have to be careful, be very careful of the differences of culture, of time, periods, and places, but we can recognize sometime, even often, maybe same trends that we can follow, and they can help to fill the gaps in the documentation, and better understand some processes that are not very clear.
Thank you. And once you're done looking at the Hittite materials, do you have plans on looking at other cultures, or do you think that the Hittite will give you what it is you're looking for?
Hittites, I guess, can tell me something. Can tell something that it can be important for some aspects of my research and of the reconstruction of the bronze production chain. But I would like also to use other to compare the linear B tablets with other documents, such as Ugaritic documents, as I told you before, because they can help in other aspects. For example, to better understand the provenance of some of copper and tin, and even how they were mixed in order to produce the bronze alloy, because there are the linear B tablets don't say anything about for example, the amount of copper and tin to make bronze, while the Ugaritic texts say this. So it can be important to better understand how bronze were produced, and how bronze were worked to make finished objects. And there are letters that were the other documents that I would like to study and to analyze, can help to better understand the circulation of copper, tin, and bronze.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed hearing about your research and your plans. Before I let you go, is there anything that you wanted to share with us, or anything you want to go into more detail about?
Maybe I can just say that for during this summer, for better study the Hittite texts, I would also like to go to the Würzburg University in Germany, because it's the most important, one of the most important centers for the Hittite studies, and especially Hittite philology. And there is a very important library where it is possible to study, and the access is very easy for studying Hittite texts, and there are many people many scholars who are studying Hittite texts, and also to Mainz, close to also in Germany, because there is the archive of Hittite texts, where there are collected all the Hittite and the words which are attested in the Hittite texts. So I can just go. I could just go there and find the word for bronze, copper, and tin, and selected the texts that I have to analyze for the research.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
been my absolute pleasure talking to you. We'll be in touch at the end of the month when everyone's interviews are done. And I hope you have a really lovely evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Lavinia. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, that was Lavinia. She is studying the production line of bronze in Mycenaean period. I love production lines and trade and the way that different cultures interact is absolutely fascinating. I am going to put the holding screen up briefly. We do have our next interviewee ready and waiting, but I have to switch babies. So give me 2 minutes and I will be right back. And I am back. I have another baby. Thank you all for your patience. And I am going to bring in Giacomo, who is our next guest. Giacomo, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry about the minor delay there. How are you?
Hi everybody.
Would you mind just introducing yourself and telling us what you are a student of?
Yes, of course. It's a pleasure to be here today. And since it's almost lunchtime in USA, I will speak about food. I'm Giacomo Casucci, a PhD candidate at Pavia University in Italy, and I'm involved in a multidisciplinary archaeological approach regarding interregional connection in Anatolia, the modern Turkey. Specifically, today I would like to talk about my research focus on food waste spread in ancient Anatolia between the second and the first millennium BC. And how do I achieve this study? The idea I have in mind is to start from a standard archaeological method, studying cooking, for example, studying cooking tools, and to integrate it with ethnographic and experimental approaches. But what I mean when I speak of experimental and ethnographic approaches. So if I manage to get this grant, I will go to Turkey in order to study and observe the traditional cooking techniques which still survive in some small villages. For example, through the interaction with the local inhabitants, I would like to prepare the traditional leavened bread called pida and cook it, bake it using the laboratory instruments, laboratory production of ancient instruments, such as the so-called Hittite baking plates. In fact, for example, the Hittites had at least 20 types of bread and as many ways to name them. This means that the bread was the basis of their diet, and as is it's today for many populations. What can my research concretely bring to the archaeology of ancient Near East, specifically ancient Anatolia? Well, food is culture, and it can be interpreted as a sort of mirror that reflects phenomena of resilience, continuity, transformation for such a period as complicated as that of passage between the second and the first millennium BC in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in addition to the approaches just I explained, what are the direct sources at our disposal to reconstruct, understand the culinary practices dating back 4,000 years ago. Unfortunately, for example, cooking is not a topic that within the written text, at least for ancient Anatolia. On the other side, we have a lot of cooking pots and fire installation coming from the archaeological excavation, usually considered trivial things, unfortunately, but which can provide us important data for our research. What I'm going to do with the fundamental contribution of my colleague and friend Alessio Mantovan is a complete analysis of every single aspect of the cooking pottery, from their production techniques to their final shape. For example, we study the raw material used to produce them and how these were transformed. The result I expect to achieve is to highlight the possible existence of different regional culinary traditions and study the interaction or differences in order to make a contribution to wider issues such as regional context, migrations of population, or cultural exchanges. This is my research.
That is fascinating. Thank you. And ancient cooking is very interesting. Do you see? I'm understanding from your presentation, there's a certain amount of continuity between the ancient practices and what happens now in some areas of Anatolia.
Yeah, studying cooking practices for me is a fundamental study, because when a simple cooking pot can provide fundamental clues for the reconstruction of historic and social context, the presence of absence or the presence or absence of specific cooking pot can suggest different access to specific foods and the presence of, for example, social hierarchies. On the other hand, the burn marks on fire installations or cooking pots can detect of a cultural identity. And last but not least, the advent of new instruments can be the signal of intercultural context or migration of population toward new regions. So only through these daily objects a scholar can arrive to understand a cultural, social, and economic and political reality of the past and the present.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Are you focusing on a particular archaeological site, or are you looking at the whole of Anatolia?
Yeah, I started from 3 specific archaeological sites, Şakleoyuk, Porsukoyuk, and Kinikoyuk, and then probably I want to extend my research at all Turkey. Mm-hmm. And I take this opportunity to thank the archaeological mission of Uşakle, Porsuk, and Kinik, and obviously the members who give me the opportunity to participate in this research and study the materials.
Is it very difficult to find good detailed information about cooking materials that have been excavated, or is this very well documented?
Yes, it's difficult because for example, in the papers, fire installation, they aren't described in detail. But in the last years, some scholars start to understand the importance of these instruments, and there are more details available for me and for other people who study these materials.
Good, thank you. What do you have planned for this summer, and how will HAPS help you with your plans?
Okay. As mentioned before, my research project is based on a series of activities, field works in Turkey. For the coming months, therefore, I plan a series of activities. At first, during the summer, I will take part in some archaeological expedition to collect and start studying the surrounding material and carry out a series of ethnographic and experimental activities. Specifically, I will try to reproduce the large Hittite baking plates. It's a typical pottery for Hittite period. And in the laboratory, I reproduce in the laboratory, and then I will use them to bake the traditional bread produced together with the local villagers of Uşaklı-Uyuk. In the second moment, in the later summer, I plan a study campaign in Ankara, where some pottery artifacts will be sent in order to analyze them. During this stay, I will also have confrontation with the other scholars to get interesting suggestions and new ideas for my studies. So this grant, although it will be used for common and daily expenses, for example, trip, accommodations, and shipping, will provide a fundamental contribution to the realization of my research.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's exactly what this grant money is designed for, so that students can spend it really on whatever they need to fund their research. We have a question from the audience asking if you have managed to connect any particular food to religious festivals or specific communal events.
Yes. In particular for the Hittite period, because the excavation of Hittite sites are concentrated in monumental buildings, a temple and palace building, and the archaeologists found, for example, a pig sacrificed, and or the archaeobotanical and archaeological analysis give information for reconstruction the production of beer, for example, in Kuşaklı-Sarısa, in a very important site in central Anatolia, very important Hittite sites. Inside a room of temple building, the archaeologists found more seeds that were used for beer production, or bulgur that is typical dishes spread in all Middle East now, and this found confirmed that it was a very long tradition dish.
That's very interesting. So it seems from what you're saying that cooking in ancient Anatolia was not just something that happened in domestic areas in the home. It's something that happened in religious spaces as well.
Yeah. The problem is that the archaeologists the research was concentrated in a public building for the Hittite period, and there aren't excavation in common place, for example, house that will give some important information about the daily life.
I see. And is that I know that that's something that has happened in Mesopotamia as well. People focus on the temples and palaces and not so much on domestic architecture. Is that the same for the whole of Anatolia, or is that just the sites that you're looking at currently?
It's the same for all Anatolia, unfortunately.
That is unfortunate. So when you're looking at the cooking implements, then is there a very wide variety of objects, or are there the same ones that show up in a lot of different places?
They are produced in local, of course, because people don't buy cooking pot outside. they produce in the same place where you have to cook.
And does it seem that people were making and creating their own, or do you think there were workshops at different sites that created things for other people to use?
For the tight period, I'm sure in the workshop there are specialized people who produce cooking pot, for example. In the first millennium, particularly in the early Iron Age, people probably start to produce at home and made pottery. There are, and this is a very important thing in my research, because in the tight period, people produce buy the cooking pot probably in workshops and well-made cooking pot, and then in the early Iron Age, the people produce cooking pot and made probably at home or in small villages, and that can provide a clue probably that there are different ways of cooking and cooking techniques in my idea.
Wonderful, thank you very much. When you have finished research this summer, what are your plans next?
Next, I probably in the summer I will study a small lot of pottery, cooking pottery, tight baking plates, and probably I take some information, but preliminary information. I have to study a very big lot of pottery, and I need to look at the other sites, for example, for sites in Central Anatolia, but in the Western Anatolia, I have to find parallels, differences. This is my plan, and integrate this data with the experimental and ethnographic approaches, because when I have in my hand a cooking pot, can I receive some data, but I have to integrate with ethnographic observation. It's very important to understand the food waste.
Thank you very much. I do not have any more questions, and we do not have anything from the audience. Is there anything extra that you would like to share? Any more details? No? That's absolutely fine. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. I find it very interesting to hear about your research, and experimental archaeology is a wonderful thing. and I will be in touch at the end of the month.
Okay. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That was Giacomo. He is looking at food production in ancient Anatolia. And I love just so many people today doing amazing research, and experimental archaeology it's one of those things that sounds really exciting. You get to like make things and then see how well they work. And it kind of gives you a connection to how people lived in the ancient past. And what he was saying there was that there is enough continuity between ancient Anatolia and modern Turkey, with the smaller villages, that actually they're using the same equipment, most likely in a very similar way. So you can go and you can really get firsthand knowledge of how food preparation probably would have worked in the ancient sites that he's excavating. So that was fascinating. I have greatly enjoyed my entire morning, and I've enjoyed having all of your company. So thank you for being with us. We are going to take a break now until 1 p.m. EDT. That is approximately 45 minutes, when we will be back with our final 4 interviews of the day. I will not be doing those interviews. I will be here in the backstage running the technical side of things. The first 2 interviews will be done by Sarah Moore, and the second 2 will be Eyal Mazaros. If you are long-standing viewers of the channel, you will know them well. They are the 2 wonderful people behind Assyriology Today. Sarah is also one of our very first HAPS scholars, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to have them both willing to work with me. They are also HAPS board members. So they will be coming and bringing their own particular brand of interview style. So again, we will be back in 45 minutes at 1 p.m. It'll be the same stream. I'm just going to leave it running and put a holding screen up. And I hope we will see you soon. Again, thank you all. Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the first round of our HAPS interviews for summer 2022. Had to remember what year it was then. It's been a long morning. Wonderful morning, but a long morning. And as I mentioned earlier, today we have the wonderful Sarah Moore, who is going to continue interviews for us. Hello, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing well, Megan. Happy to be here.
Yes, very happy to have you. It's a wonderful thing. And we are right on the dot at 1 p.m. and we have our next interviewee with us. So without further ado, I am going to step out. Everybody, remember, if you have questions for any of our guests today, please leave them in the live stream chat and I will pass them on to Sarah to ask. So thank you, everybody. I will be right here.
All right. Oh, give it time to load. Well,
it was not supposed to happen. Okay, we are going to just wait for a minute for Lucia to come back. Clearly some mild internet problems there. Always happens. It's usually me.
I mean, like, my cat just entered the room. He's awake and ready to party, so like he might be chiming in every once in a while.
We'll have the cat, we'll have my babies. be great. And we have Lucia back again. There we go.
All right. Lucia, can you hear us?
Not. That is.
Options that it was not there before. I'm sorry. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, welcome to the stream. So why don't we just go ahead and get started?
Do you hear me? Oh no.
Yes. Can you hear us? So I can hear you, I can see you. There's just a little bit of a delay of things coming through. Can't hear you, Megan.
No, see, it's always me, except when it's someone else. But normally it's me. There we go. I was going to suggest to Lucia that she restart her computer, but I think she has started doing that anyway. So it's just you and I.
All right, sounds good.
Never something I'm going to complain about. Chatting with you, it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, not what people say. But like, yeah, not bad. For those of you who I guess don't know me, I was one of the first recipients of this scholarship several years ago. Used it to fund my first ever digital humanities project.
It was a beautiful project.
Now I'm like a full-on digital humanist doing digital humanities things, and I'm finishing my PhD in August. So
I didn't know you were finishing in August. That is wonderful news.
I'll send you the link for the presentation.
Please do. That would be fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And we have Lucia back again. And you're moving this time, so I think... Oh, no, we've dropped again. Lucia, could you try turning off your camera, please, and see if that helps with the audio? Sometimes that frees up some bandwidth. Unsure. Sarah, I want to hear about this amazing theatre / what is it, cinema in LA that is like Egyptian revival.
Oh yeah, so I'm originally from Los Angeles. I grew up going to a lot of these famous theaters like Grauman's, or the artist formerly known as Grauman's Chinese, Egyptian theater. Have fond memories of going to the El Capitan theater. But it wasn't until I started studying the ancient world that I really kind of noticed all of the exotic revival that's happening in Los Angeles and how it seems to be almost exclusively in these like big theaters, probably due to, the influence of Hollywood, and did some digging. And it turns out also the influence of D.W. Griffith's film Intolerance. You may recognize D.W. Griffith from his racism. He is the director of The Birth of a Nation, and his response to the well-placed racist criticism of that film was his film Intolerance, where he focused on 4 different areas of human history and started to focus on how like religious intolerance was the root of all of our problems. And one scene was set in Babylon. And so and back then, like no CGI, couldn't build it digitally. So he built a 2/3 model of what he believed Babylon looked like, based on current research. We actually have letters from Assyriologists at the time writing to him saying like, it's beautiful, it's so accurate. With the benefit of time, we look back and we're like, I mean, good job, but
not quite.
I mean, it's beautiful. And so, it hit right in like the 1920s. The film came out in 1916. Silent film, and 1920s, 1930s is when exotic revival and Egyptomania was really hitting the US. In places like New York, it was hitting it for the second time, but in places like LA, it was hitting it for the first time, because Los Angeles is a relatively young city in the United States. And so it resulted in all of these really beautiful theaters and an outlet mall called the Citadel, which is Assyrian palace themed, but the theming wasn't for the mall, it was for a tire factory 100 years ago. Yeah, that's it. This is the Citadel, which...
It was for a tire factory?
Yeah, it was for a tire factory called the Samson Tire Company. And the guy who made it, he calls his tire factory Samson because he wanted it to evoke strength. But he designed it, the design for the factory started in 1928 and it was opened in 1929. 1928 was coincidentally the year that American excavations started at Khorsabad, where Sargon II, king of Assyria's palace is. And so all these beautiful, never before seen drawings in the US were making their way over. And so this guy, Adolf Schleicher, he goes, Samson, Sargon, both really strong, powerful kings. I want to evoke that in the architecture. And so thus was born the Samson Tire Factory, and it's a national historic place. So it's kept in beautiful shape. The colors are in excellent condition. There are these beautiful lamassu in the front of the building. When it was turned into an outlet mall and updated the second time, they added these big screens that you can see from the freeway and put giant lamassu on top of them, so you can see them from a while, like far away as you're driving down.
That's amazing. That's incredible. I had no idea these places even existed until you put specifically this photograph on Twitter.
There are a few things I thought I might be known for on Twitter, but like the thread on architecture was not it.
This was not one of them. I just got an email from Lucia. She's trying to connect on her phone, so we will give her a few more minutes and kind of fill in the airspace, which I feel like we're doing a pretty good job at so far. If anyone has any questions, by the way, what's your favorite color? How old is your cat? How is your cat, by the way?
He's great. He's a rascal. He's very orange, always hungry.
That's on brand.
His gotcha day is on Monday.
I feel like your cat and my 4-year-old have an awful lot in common. Rascal, hungry, loud.
And I feel like when I talk about things with my cat, it's like talking about like the parent of a young child. Like talk to my parents a lot about how Thomas yells for things, but I can't give them to him when he's yelling because I can't set the precedent that yelling produces that result.
Yeah. It's surprisingly, there are some surprising parallels between raising small children and I guess raising animals as well. Especially cats, I feel.
Yeah, cats. I mean, people sometimes act like cats are these wonderful stoic creatures, but they're really just like dinguses. I mean, they just...
huge dinguses. Okay, we have Lucia back, so
gosh, it looks like I'm hearing you now. I'm so sorry that I have to do it with my phone.
No, you're fine. It happens. I'm going to remove myself. Remember, audience, ask questions. I will be passing them to...
All right, it's so great to have you here. Finally, the connection looks great. So why don't we jump right in and you can tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're studying, and what your research interests are.
Thank you. Okay, so, hello, and thank you for having me here. I'm Lucia Collotto, and I'm a PhD student in archaeology at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. My research interest is mainly in sensory archaeology and landscape archaeology, and let's get into a little bit more about this, right? So I actually started as a MA in sensory anthropology, and mainly it was about the sense of olfaction, so the sense of smell. And then when I got into some courses in archaeology, I asked myself if it was possible to detect the smell and the practice of maybe burning substances, aromatics, etc. in the past. And actually, the fact that I was able to live for a couple of years in Saudi Arabia gave me a positive thinking about it, let's say, because I got into this interest about the incense route that, of course, started from Yemen. But effectively, they were mainly in the country of what is called Saudi Arabia today. So the incense route, as the name, it was mainly about traits on incense and other aromatics that were precious as gold, as it's also named in the Bible, right? And so in effect, in Saudi Arabia, when we think about the landscape of Saudi Arabia, which is developed from, if we see developing from south to north, we can guess that effectively the two incense routes were started from the south and went up north, up to the Mediterranean, and then to all Europe. And so when we think about the landscape specifically of this incense route, we are of course talking about the heritage of their country. And if the eastern coast is a little bit more known about it, the eastern coast, which is the one that I am focusing on, is less known. And when we are talking about the incense route, we are talking, of course, about the incense burners and other materials and findings that are connected to this. But when are we talking about sensory archaeology then? So when I was there, I just noticed how bahur, and when I'm referring to bahur, I'm referring to incense and all the aromatics that can be burned to smell good. So for the ambience or even dress, even hair. So this bahur, so again, incense and aromatics, are so used that even one Saudi girl told me once, look, bahur is like food and water for us. It's so used, it's so common that effectively we use them every day, but specifically in the festivities. And so for me, it was the first time at all that I smelled that scent. And it was very fascinating. It was fascinating, but more than fascinating, it was kind of having a dream into a different time and space. And so using that imagination, I tried to understand how I could effectively discover or analyze the sense of smell in archaeology in this case. And here, that's how it comes the gap. When I tried and started to ask to Saudis, this bahur, I wonder if these were the same incense, the same aromatics that were traded like more than 2,000 years ago in your country. And I was kind of shocked in looking at their face, and they say, oh, really? We didn't know that. So effectively, there was this disconnection between the ancient incense route history and the contemporary use of incense and aromatics, so bahur, as I said, where they actually didn't know that this was a long-standing custom and use that went and was and still is very present in their life. So I told myself, this is a heritage gap. So this gap about heritage is, as you may see, is not only about the tangible heritage, so the materials, the incense route, so the landscape that can be seen and touched, but is also about something that is intangible heritage. So the history behind it, told by contemporary people through their storytelling, through the use that they do with these aromatics. And of course, the aim is to develop this heritage into potential tourism development. So, of course, Saudi Arabia especially are trying to develop a tourism and of course enhancing their heritage. And as they say, bahur or incense is like food and water. It's pretty intense. It's pretty felt by the population. An example is also that the kahwa, so the Arabic coffee, has been enlisted inside the UNESCO as intangible heritage. And so maybe Bahur can be the same, actually have the same root. Well, and yeah, I am actually applying for this HAFS Found because I've always been working and studying together. You can tell that I'm not a fresh student, okay? But of course, this founding will give me the possibility to stay more in the country, because I'm not there now. And now that with the COVID regulation is kind of relaxing, hopefully, crossing fingers. And so maybe I can effectively go there, and that will be my main topic, my main goal is to interview them in person. I did already an online survey, and it was very productive because I had more than 300 answers to the survey about this special heritage. But of course, you can understand that having an interview face-to-face, it could be more productive for my PhD thesis. And so that's how I'm here. Yes, that's.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a fascinating project, so much so that we already have questions coming in from the audience. So I'll start with the first one that came in. It said, is it possible to see changes in the use of Bahur between the historical period you're looking at and contemporary times?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you. Actually, looking at that differences about the use, of course, we cannot. I wish I can have of course, going back in time. But there's one thing that made me think that maybe, and of course, I will ask more to the locals. That made me think that probably the practice was very similar. Is the incense burners? The incense burners are very similar to the ancient one. So the ancient one are usually like a 4 square. Like even sometimes very small, okay, and they were burnt. They burnt the substances with some charcoal. They burn now with some charcoal, and then they put the substances on the charcoal, and then you can effectively smell the aromatics and the scents. And another one, another reason that can give me, let's say, a link to the ancient time is that, well, this is not specifically pre-Islamic that I'm focusing in, but during Muhammad time, effectively there's an hadith in the Quran that said that it's very important to have use the perfume, use the good smell. So I'm actually trying to connect this gap with these two, let's say, links.
And when you talk with the locals, when you get the opportunity to ask them about their practice, to make these connections, what kinds of information are you hoping to get from them?
Yes. So yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I have some kind of a step-to-step interview for them, and I'm actually using an experimental method which I used in my previous MA anthropology. So I'm trying with the questions. They are divided in 4 types of questions. Let's say, making a circle of it. So I am trying to. I will ask them, of course, the practical one. That is, let's say, the body, why they use the scent, if it is just for smelling good, or if it is for relaxing, or other things. And then there is, so the 4 parts is the body, so specifically the practical, the tangible, let's say, part of Bahur. And then, of course, the mind, so if they use it in a connection, maybe because their parents taught them, for example, and so if it is something in the family. And then, of course, I ask the emotions. So if they use it, what it gives to them, if it gives happiness or relaxing or whatever they feel. And then, of course, also the spiritual, if it is some kind of connected, as I said, there's an hadith in the Quran, and so if they use that effectively also for religion, I don't know. So I will ask also this part.
And that's actually a really great connection to your next audience question that we have. So what evidence do we have for Bahur in ancient times? Is it just textual, archaeological, or do we have something else entirely?
All right. So as far as I know, there is, of course, incense burners, because mainly in all the Gulf, not only Saudi Arabia, okay? All the Gulf countries, so Syria, Lebanon, Oman, Yemen, of course. There are incense burners, a lot of them. Also, like, for example, in the British Museum. Also, so not only, let's say, in the Near East, so there's also in some museum in the European, for example, in some European countries. And so, and then, of course, a lot. Yes, for sure, textual, because there is ancient text, Plinium, the Old, for example, talk a lot about the trades and how much the incense was even paid by Romans and, for example, by Romans, but also other population in the Mediterranean, just to have this incense for them to burn. So there are also textual testimonies, let's say, of this incense trades and use.
Yes, thank you so much. And can you tell us a little bit more about the archaeological contexts where incense burners are found?
Right. So incense, actually, we're talking about Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has not a big history about archaeology, let's say. Okay, it's a very, very new country for archaeology. Okay, so a lot of sites have just or are now excavated. My main site, actually, that I got interested into is Taj, that is in the eastern coast. Let's say that is maybe three quarters of an hour from the coast, from the sea, and in the articles and other research that I read of other experts and academics, they some of them, not all of them, some of them suppose that was the old Gerra, so the biblical town that has never been found. And effectively, in Taj specifically in 1995, they, for a chance, someone a local discover a tomb, and inside this tomb there was a funerary jewels. Sorry, there was a golden mask, there was golden gloves, and there were also other materials that can be connected to the wealth that they effectively had for these trades. And so particularly, if you see the landscape also of Saudi Arabia, I'm focusing on the eastern coast because I know that better, okay? But there is a connection between one town to the other, where oases are. Of course, I mean, they were walking days and days through the desert, so they needed water. So the stops, the caravanserai, they were the old towns, where now there are still water oases. So it's very important to study the landscape. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, no problem. You're the star of this. Interrupt me if you need to. So normally I would let you go, but because we had some tech difficulties, I'm going to make sure we fit in this last audience question because it's also one that I'm curious about personally. So selfishly, I'm going to ask it. So the last question we have is there some evidence or indication that specific smells have some symbolic or ritual function? Are there specific smells connected to certain occasions or rituals?
Nice. I like this question. Very nice. Actually, for me, it was a sensory experience, okay, when I was there, because you know that the sense of smell is different from the other four smells, okay, neurologically talking, because it connects to the memory, to the immediate memory without thinking, okay? So it's basically kind of an unconscious, okay? But when I smelled for the first time bahur, so when we talk about bahur, is general, okay? It can be incense, can be a lot of aromatics together, but it can also be oud. And oud is a specific wood that comes from Cambodia, for example, the most expensive one, and has a special scent that effectively, what is stunned, it was astonishing to me, is like when you smell, you say, I told myself, wow, I never smelled this before. You can feel that you are trying to do a connection with that smell, and you cannot, because you never smelled that before. So if I understood the question, is like the astonishing part of the sense of smell is effectively to smell something that is there, that is still there, that has this long-standing history, and maybe it was the same smell like more than 2,000 years ago. And so it's like a trip in time, maybe in the ancient history, through the smell.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering all of our audience questions and for coming to speak to us today. Best of luck with your research. I do hope you get out to Saudi Arabia and to get to conduct your interviews. For everyone else, we're going to take just a few-minute break, and then we'll come back with our next interview.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for waiting. So I think we can just go ahead and welcome Emily, our next interview. Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, of course. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. So why don't we jump right in? Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're studying, and your research interests.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. First and foremost, please forgive me if I lose my voice. Unfortunately, after 2 years, COVID finally got me. If that happens, I apologize. But my name is Emily. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Princeton University in the Department of Art and Archaeology. And I focus on the art and culture of Upper Egypt and the New Kingdom. I'm actually the result of Princeton's first foray into Egyptology, so happy to be spreading the field to as many institutions as possible. So I hope to be able to do everyone proud and become the inaugural first doctor of Egyptian art and archaeology from the institution.
Nice. That's a really interesting place to be in, for sure.
Yeah, it's an experience. Some struggles, but also it's been really awesome. So
excuse me 1 second. I need to grab my cat because he's being a jerk.
No problem.
Jesus. Okay. I'm sorry. This is Thomas. He's going to be in baby jail for a second.
Hello, Thomas.
So back to you. What are your plans for the summer, and how would a HAP scholarship help you achieve those plans?
Sure. So I'm currently I'm actually defending my proposal next week. But so generally my project and my interests lie in questions of like identity, gender, landscape, and the intersection of the physical body and its representation in artwork. So I've kind of combined this into a dissertation topic / where my summer project will be going. So I'm studying the expression of what I'd call postmortem identity, or some scholars have called it supernatural identity, which is a much flashier term. So doing that specifically in the New Kingdom tombs of northern Upper Egypt. Now I know that's super specific, but that's for a reason. I was really bothered by kind of these wide sweeping assumptions about who people were or how they could express themselves based on a handful of tombs at capital sites like Memphis and Thebes. And I really think the field is moving in the right direction, focusing less on royalty and more on individuals. Or the general population. But I feel like we need to push our work to be a little bit more locally focused to actually understand the complexities of society and identity during this period. I mean, we wouldn't say that the culture of LA and New York City are exactly the same, although we're in the same country. So why should we do that for antiquity? And I have a particular interest in burials, so that's where I found my foothold. So my work specifically undertakes a comparative analysis of art, tomb architecture, burial goods, and the use of landscape at the sites of Khao, Akhmim, Abydos, and El Kab. My goal is to use the data I collect to see what the local burial practices and artistic expression can tell us about their identities. While I'm using a mix of archaeology and art historical approaches, I'm also researching these spaces using landscape analysis of phenomenology. So that being examining the landscape, built, spiritual, natural, and how the tombs are nestled within or operate as part of these spaces. The phenomenology part takes into account the physical experience of walking around a space, eye line, and using sensorial experiences to try and get an idea of why the spot was chosen. And I know this part can feel a little too theoretical to some people in archaeology. I was very much trained originally as a hard science archaeologist. But I opened my mind to this approach, and I honestly found it really gives another dimension to some of the data. And it's been proven to be an extraordinary approach in other subfields, as we just saw from Lucia right before May. But Egyptology can often fall behind on some of these newer approaches, so it has much less of a history in my field. So that's the quick rundown of the project, but for this summer specifically. So hopefully I'll be ABD as of Wednesday. And so my plan is to really dive into some field research. So my plan is pretty much twofold for the summer. The first is to try to spend time in Egypt at each of those sites I listed, so Khao, Akhmim, Abydos, and El Kab. And I'll be sampling from these by collecting photos of individual tombs and taking some phenomenological data down to build a database for future comparative analysis. I'm also planning on excavating in January at Abydos, pending approvals. So a summer visit to the area I'll be excavating would be super helpful to begin doing some of the landscape analyses prior to, for lack of a better term, altering the landscape myself. The second leg of my work, I am hoping will be archival and will be based in the UK, where I'm hoping to be able to get access to some older scholars' excavation journals, such as Petrie, Brunton, and maybe Pete too. I know there's some of those in the UK. Unfortunately, many of the sites I'm working with have never been published, or what has been excavated is poorly published because it was done in the 18 and early 1900s. There's actually a line in one of Petrie's publications that states that, quote, only the tombs of interest have been detailed within the publication. And he left out about 70% of the tombs he excavated. So I want to see if I can squeeze out any more information from those tombs that I may no longer be able to access. I also think this could be helpful in mapping out areas that have never been considered, so I can make sure I can create more of a holistic view of practices at these 4 sites. So the funds would be of great help funding that travel, and also for photo permissions for the tombs I'll be visiting, which can be shockingly expensive and very expensive to access as well. And this may also extend to photo permissions for museum collections, if and when I figure out where some of the tomb assemblages are stored, since I really want to look into each tomb as holistically as possible. So obviously, as most scholars, any and all funding is always extremely helpful for field research.
Yes, and as someone who spent literally over $1,000 for 3 tablet photos from the British Museum for my dissertation, like I very much feel that. Yeah, for those of you listening, some institutions are really great and they don't charge you anything depending on what you're using it for. Other institutions will charge you a lot of money regardless of what you're using it for. And so, you know, depending on what project you're working on, you run into these things fairly often. And so, you know, going into that, you know, Megan and I clearly both have the same question about your fascinating holistic approach, mixing gender studies and landscape archaeology. So how do you combine these two in your work? They're such different aspects of the field.
Absolutely. So with landscape studies, it's of course extremely interesting to see where people have chosen to be placed in the landscape, or especially at Abydos where they are allowed to access. And at looking at some of the data in the northern cemetery in Abydos, we have a proliferation of more only female tombs, which is pretty rare for the New Kingdom. And then we have what's called a cemetery of chantresses too, placed in the landscape in this area that is has been closed off for years for access for burials. And so while some people would say, okay, well, it's just the position. As Chantress of Osiris, they're given this position in the landscape that they can access. I think there's a really interesting question as to why that space and why they were potentially allowed. We have the male priests of Osiris being buried in a very different area. And so does their association with, I know some scholars have argued perhaps this portion of the landscape was viewed as a female itself, a female deity. And so kind of playing with those ideas of how gender can dictate, not so much of, I'm also playing a lot with not assuming gender too. So things get complicated, but I think it's a really important question of whether or not gender played a role in these things, or if they've kind of been dismissed by former scholars. They were placed here away from the men because they couldn't be buried in the same area, was previous assumptions. I would instead argue perhaps they had a special role that could have been associated with their gender. And does this area of the landscape grant them special access to certain portions of the Osiris festival, or even specific portions of the goddess of the landscape themselves? So it's definitely going to take a lot of theoretical work, but I'm finding it really interesting and really successful so far. So
yeah, so you're taking like a positive approach rather than a negative approach, right? There's something special about this space and these people rather than just the fact that they're not men.
Exactly. As opposed to like, oh, well, you know, it's not the same grave goods. It's not the same area of the landscape. So this must just be where high status women get placed. And also the question of why do we have so many women being given their own tombs in the Northern Cemetery? That's a question no one's asked before. They just assume, oh, it's just a small percent of the population, so don't worry about it. There's just a few extra. But when you compare that to the capital sites, it's quite remarkable. It says something about something that's being allowed or encouraged in this site, in this space, in the landscape that we don't see elsewhere.
And because we have a very relevant audience question, I promise I'll come back to the second one, whoever asked it, but there's a really perfectly placed one here that says, but is there an emic understanding of gender or gender categories or gendered roles that you'll get to use in this research?
Absolutely. So it's a little complicated because with some of these quote unquote, what some scholars, and I hate this, but have called backwater sites, we have a lot less textual reference to things like gender roles and stuff like that. So I'm actually taking an approach that I have found used in prehistoric English archaeology, in which the gender isn't assumed based on the body nor the grave goods themselves. And it's kind of a more holistic examination that allows for I mean, obviously, we all have our own ethnocentric battles in examining this, but I found that to be an interesting way to not assume that what's happening at the Capitol or assume what prior scholars who have very much taken a Eurocentric approach have applied to this data. And so while I don't have a written record, which is always the go-to, you know, text and material together can sometimes be extremely helpful. I'm hoping to be able to access something a little bit closer to what was being performed at these sites, and whether or not they fit into what we're seeing in the texts and the tombs of other sites.
Awesome, thank you. And so switching gears a little bit to the archival side of your research, we have a question from the audience is, when you're working with unpublished sites, how do you go about accessing that information?
So this is a great question. It very much depends on when the site was excavated, first of all, and then whether or not the excavation records are being housed in an institution, whether they are with the excavation lead or something of the sort. So the archival work really begins with trying to find a historiography of the site. When was the site excavated? How many times and by who? And then that takes tracking down maybe where those excavation journals are, or maybe prefacing that with, are there excavation journals? And then seeing if these are institutions that allow for study of these items. When they're in private holding, it can sometimes get a little sticky. Not everyone wants to allow academic research for these things. But worst comes to worst, if there is no access to these things, I really think going to the site and seeing what we can see still, if you can get permissions, excavating things for the second, third time can give you enough insight to start commenting on the stuff with a full acknowledgement that it has been excavated in the past, it has been disrupted. There's only so much you can do at some point, but I very much am optimistic because many of the individuals who excavated at the sites that I'm looking at did have excavation journals that are held in institutions. So as long as I can get approval, I should have some extra data that I don't have from the library alone.
Yeah, and all of us know who've ever worked with an ancient object, getting any little piece of information, especially when they've been excavated very early on, is just so valuable. And so I have a question of my own, knowing that some of these old excavation reports don't give you necessary information, like they'll just, or an object just appears in something like the British Museum and it says, oh, it's probably from this time period and from, you know, Egypt. Are there other sort of things in the archives or things that these people have written down, maybe just about their life or their travels, that help you place some of these things, even if they're not being super specific in their excavation reports?
Absolutely. So I actually just came across a publication, and forgive me, I can't remember the scholar, but it was a fantastic work where the individual essentially traced down all of the records of a specific sale to a number of UK institutions and then also the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they were able to track down, based on the seller's provenance, based on the seller's history, where the item potentially came from, and then use a comparanda of actually confirmed items from the site to try and build out where some of these items came from. And they got as far as potentially identifying what cemetery at Abydos they came from. So while sometimes this can be a probably dissertation topic on its own, it's definitely something possible. And so if I see something in the collection at, say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the British Museum, and it says possibly Upper Egypt, and we don't specifically know where, it can feel really upsetting at first, but I have been able in some cases to kind of narrow it down a bit more. But that being said, I think that because of the collecting back in the 17, 18, 1900s, there's unfortunately going to be items that slip through the cracks. And until we have a better way to examine them, that's just the result of where the field is at this time.
Yep, I feel that very strongly. I'm currently working with tablets and whatnot for my own dissertation that are from Babylon, maybe. You know, run into that all the time. And so I'm very curious about sort of what you led with about your background being, you know, the science side of archaeology, now being in the art history department at Princeton, going to be their first Egyptology PhD, which is unbelievably exciting. What has it been like for you to transfer from the science to the art history side, and how has, you know, being in an art history department affected how you do Egyptology?
That is a fantastic question. And I think it's really interesting, especially because I feel like there's only a handful of institutions around the world that include Egyptology in art history. And so we're starting to make that connection that maybe other fields have done 20, 30, 40 years in the past. So it's about time. But it's been really interesting. I got my bachelor's degree in archaeology, and primarily in archaeology in the United States. So I worked for a while as a archaeologist for a number of CRM firms, so cultural resource management, very much field archaeologist, digging shovel test pits every day and then doing the lab work. And so when I decided that I wanted to maybe shift a little bit, it was less because I didn't want to be a field archaeologist. And I'm very blessed at Princeton that we are an art and archaeology department. So I have access to our concession at Abydos. I can still dig. But I worried that potentially being only a hard science archaeologist wasn't giving me as holistic of a perspective as I could get about some of the art, about some of the evidence for culture context that weren't necessarily things that could be studied using XRF or another specifically scientific approach. So it was an interesting change. I actually had, in between my bachelor's and PhD, I did a master's at NYU. And their Egyptian studies program really fused the two. So I took courses in Egyptian archaeology and Egyptian art history. And I think that gave me a good mix of the two, that I didn't feel like a complete outcast in an art history department, nor did I feel like I was giving up archaeology to some degree. So the experience has ultimately been positive. And I really, really think that had I not fused the two, I would have been less open-minded to using some of the art historical or the sensorial approaches that I've found to be kind of my calling card for a lot of my work. So I'm really grateful for that experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. And love hearing about how people come to Egyptology, come to studying the ancient world, and then get involved in these really fascinating projects.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, sensorial archaeology. You know, Lucia just touched on this a little bit about, you know, things like incense burners and whatnot that give her clues into how these things were used. And so when you think about, you know, sensorial aspects to these landscapes, what kinds of things are you looking for that give you clues into this kind of reconstruction?
Absolutely. So I usually start with what is called a phenomenological approach. So that's placing yourself in the landscape and just beginning to observe. I usually do it at each tomb that I'm going to be using because the experience is so different across a landscape. You can be in one place and you're experiencing everything completely different from something across the site. So while I'm there, I usually take into account things like where the wind blows or things blocking it. Obviously, we don't have the same built landscape today, but you can kind of work with it a little bit to imagine, especially in Egypt, that sweet northerly wind is so important. So who has access to that? Is it being blocked by something? I also like to take into consideration lighting. So at what point of the day is the sun hitting it? Is there any play on the outside or inside with solar lighting, or is it something that would require kind of an internal lighting? And how could that change the way that the reliefs or the paintings are viewed differently? And then I also like to see where in the landscape these items are, the tombs are, in association with major landscape natural structures. So at Abydos, we have this beautiful wadi that cuts through the cliffs. And so the question is, does the tomb have a view of that? Does the tomb have a view of the early dynastic cemetery at the site? And is there some sort of social value to that? Does it have access to other parts that could be seen as either religious or supernaturally important, such as the procession of Osiris that happens at the site? And I do actually try to take into consideration other things, other senses as well. So the olfactory senses, if there's a festival happening, which we know at several of these sites was happening on a yearly basis, are there certain scents? Are there certain tastes that maybe visitors or the deceased could be imagined to be partaking in? And I think all of these things, when you put them together. Oh, one thing I also forgot to mention was not just the connection to the landscape that's natural, but also the built one. So who are they being placed next to? Are they older tombs? Are we trying to have an appeal to antiquity? Are they more important people, quote unquote, in the local society? Do we have an appeal to authority? I just think that there's a lot more besides just the physical tomb, how it's built, and who's on the inside that we can tell when we kind of open it up to the senses, to what we see, what we hear, what we smell, even if it's imagined to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have one last question on the topic of landscape changes, and then we'll let you go. And it's simply, how do you account for landscape changes?
Yep. This is a huge one, especially in Egypt, especially because, of course, we don't have the inundation anymore too, which seriously affects the landscape, along with other changes. Modern building of towns, we have the destruction of tombs, so they may not be above ground anymore. And this is a complicated thing to deal with, of course, because I think we need to recognize that we aren't there. You know, you can take it too far and be like, this was my exact experience, so this is exactly how they experienced it back then. And that's just not logical, especially when it comes to a ever-changing landscape. And so I think that admitting that there is, you know, a little bit of play here that needs to be accounted for, but also B, kind of anchoring the theory or anchoring what you're seeing in the things that we know haven't changed too much. And so, and I keep going back to Abydos because that's the primary site I work at, but we know the wadi was there. We know how important it was due to text, due to artistic work. So if we're anchoring it there and then building out from there, it's okay to go a little bit more theoretical with some of the things that have changed, but making sure that, you know, your primary claims are based on things that you can still observe, I think is a good way to balance the two, and mentioning that the landscape has changed. It really frustrates me when people don't mention that in their publications. So that's something I will definitely be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because you're working with old publications that are missing information you would like. You want to make sure you give people the information.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us, for answering my questions and our audience questions. Best of luck with your summer research.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And to everyone watching, we are going to take a break for a few minutes and we'll be back with a new host and more interviews. See you then.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the final two interviews for today for the Summer Research Grant for Humans Against Poor Scholarship. We're very excited to talk to our final two applicants today. So thank you, as always, for joining us. I'm taking over as host duties from Sarah, who did a phenomenal job just before. And I'm very excited to introduce you to our next applicant, Francesco Del Bravo. Francesco, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, you're welcome. Nice to meet you. And
Nice.
nice to see you again.
So can you start off by telling us a little bit about what your research interests for the summer are?
Well, first of all, because last year I already applied, but it was on a completely different topic, let's say. This year we finally started with a professor from the University of Rome, which is my alma mater in a way, even if I'm in Berlin now based, a new project in the central part of Oman. So let's say mainly where the Al Ajwar Mountains, which are the mountains covering almost the entirety of the territory of Oman, in the middle range of this chain, we started a new survey in between three small villages just underneath the Piedmont of the mountain, which represent the second highest peak in Oman. And there, during the survey, we were able to identify lots of archaeological traces coming mainly referred to nomadic occupations or mobility more generally, so to say. This because Oman has a long tradition about mobility and the creation of some kind of different social structure compared to other famous civilizations like Mesopotamia, Iran, or the Hindus. But in some way, it was taking some different characteristics from the three major civilizations that were surrounding it in a way, geographically speaking, because you find both imports coming from Mesopotamia, technology from Iran, technology from the Indus Valley too. So once we started the survey, as I said, we detected a lot of occupations and mobility. In this context, we were strangely for Oman because there's not a lot of big occupations or properly tell, as we usually call it in the Middle East more generally, or on the Mediterranean side, let's say. And so we also collected a lot of pottery, and we were able to identify in this particular village in the area of Al Mawil, which is in the central part of the survey area, we identified this huge archaeological site, because we are speaking about something 6-7 hectares, which is quite big for the place we are. When compared to other places in the world, clearly it's something smaller. But for Oman, it's a kind of important occupation we were able to detect. And also quite amazingly, the entire archaeological site was covered with thousands and thousands of fragments of pottery, which clearly needs to be studied. And this will be the first entry in this kind of material, first of all for me, but also for this part of Oman more generally, because to date, there's still not a single study which takes care of the pottery more generally for the imports and stuff like that and comparisons. But also there's not properly a seriation of the pottery for the Oman itself. So this would help me go along the summer again in Oman for a kind of study season, and in the relation with the ministry we have been working with too, to be able to see this pottery and finally starting working on this pottery, cataloging, photographing, and if there's time allowance from the ministry, because it also has to pass through that, we will also be able to make some kind of scientific analysis on the pottery, like spectrography, Raman spectrography, for the use of colors, and it's mainly important for this kind of luxury pottery you will find. So what is painted or what has kind of decorative traces over the body or inside the pot. On the other side, it would also be interesting to have some neutron activation analysis, because this would help for the first time to try to issue where this kind of wares were coming from, where the pasties, the cores were excavated and then used for production. And at the same time, you also see if there are some technological imports coming from these nearby regions, because as I said, Roman is probably on the route which was connecting commercially from the 4 millennium on, at least the Hindus with the Mesopotamian world, and from there clearly running through Syria, North Iraq, and then to the Mediterranean Sea. so opening on the Mediterranean. So this would be quite important, and that's the main reason I'm here speaking today.
That's a fantastically interesting project. Thousands of pottery shards sounds like I think it's incredibly important to dive into this. Tell us, how does HAPS funding support you doing this research?
Well, it's probably on the technical point of view. It would allow me to be there for some longer months than we usually are able to, and also to find collaborations with people from one, because it's also something missing from the point of view. So you have institutions coming from the West more generally, but also from China and other parts of the world at this time. But there's not properly a school or some research done by Omani and by Omani students. So this, we were already working with the ministry this summer, discussing about it. And it was my idea to start creating some sort of storeroom, which should be, ideally, let's say, open to the public, open to the students, which would help create them knowledge about pottery technology and about materials more generally, especially because it's coming from their own country and sometimes they don't know anything about. So this would be the main point in this research.
That's fantastic to hear. We have some questions about your research.
For sure.
For one, for those who don't have experience with archaeological sites or archaeological records, can you describe exactly how you would analyze pottery?
Well, simply you go in a lab, physically take the shards to a lab, and in the lab there are some spectrographer which will analyze the cores of the pottery, the chemical composition of the pottery, and in this way we are able to see, first of all, the provenience of the material, so the clay actually that was used, where it was coming from, because every ore in the world as kind of a barcode, so it's recognizable from the traces it left on the pottery and inside the pottery. But also, aside from that, you were also able to detect with the spectrography, in the so-called Rackman spectrography, that is interested mainly with colors and pigments. So that would be more related to what I was calling the imports from other regions, because what was mainly import from the Indian side, most of all, because there's a long tradition over there where this kind of big luxury pottery covered with decoration, covered with painting. This would be helping analyzing and seeing the provenience of these pigments, if there was some kind of exchange in technology between the Indus civilization and this kind of mobile entities running through Oman during the 4th, 3rd, and even 2nd millennium BC.
Is this spectrographic analysis destructive at all? Does it do any damage to the pottery that you make?
No, not at all. Nothing. So it's like taking a radiography to your body. So you can see what's in, but there's no kind of destruction in any way with the materials. So that's also another good part of doing this kind of analysis, and not others, for example, in which we are supposed to properly destroy, even if a small chunk, but yeah, in any way you are destroying something, an artifact.
Yeah, this sounds definitely preferable, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
We have more questions from the audience. What contexts are these pottery shards found in?
What, sorry?
What context do you find these pottery shards in? Do you know?
Well, this maybe it was my fault on my side, because as I know, not everybody is an archaeologist, so mainly it has no context because it was taken during a survey. So making a survey means you select an area, which in this case was completely unmapped and unknown, and you start properly wandering around with the help of locals, which would hint you to, there's an archaeological site over there, or I know that there was something on that crest or that ridge, whatever it is. And then you physically walk on the ground and you collect as much artifact as possible. But you simply could pick it up from the ground, what is coming out of the ground. You are not, if you don't have an allowance to make excavation, especially in some countries, then you're gonna get in troubles. So for the moment, when you do a survey, you collect, you divide, you select, you have recognized the numbers and tags for everything you collect, and then for the moment you store it. and then you start the study season or the study on these materials. But there's no excavation involved in this case. After you detect this area, you can, according to materials, so what you found, you can try to ask for an excavation project. So you would select one single site or one single area in the survey area and decide to work there. So for the moment, these materials are not out of context because we know the place, there was a GPS measurement taken, so we have everything mapped, but there's no proper excavation involved.
So there are just thousands of pottery sherds freely available on the ground as you were walking by?
Yeah, usually yes. Not everywhere, but usually when you work in the Middle East, it's quite likely that you find some pottery on the ground. Not only pottery, sometimes depending on the site you're in, but yeah, it's quite common to find it.
That's fantastic. Are you able to reconstruct any more of the context based on this analysis that you're doing? Are you able to tell if something comes from different types of buildings based on your analysis?
Well, let's say that the main point would be not probably to reconstruct the single context because, as I said, that needs more excavations. Maybe you can have with magnetic surveys, you can see, you can detect what's underneath, but it's not probably something that gives you an idea of the context of this sherd or this bowl or whatever it is. Instead, you're able to reconstruct, for example, the paths of mobility through this pottery and through the analysis. That would be quite interesting, especially when you think about a country which has grown up during the millennia on the base of mobility, people mobility, and pastoralism more generally, since the climatic area, it's not so friendly for agriculture in some way. It was an adaptive way. So in this way, you would understand the way these people was adapting to the environment and to the risks of the environment too.
Very cool. So speaking of paths of mobility, then we have a question from the audience. Do you think that this research will show contact between Mesopotamia and the Proto-Elamites that we didn't previously know about?
Well, Proto-Elamites says for the moment it's completely, I would say, unknown on this side of the Middle East. The majority of contacts we are able to reconstruct are with Mesopotamia, because we know from the text from the third millennium on, for example, that it was the place where mainly copper use in Mesopotamia was coming from. So it was stick there and then brought to Mesopotamia by boat, for example, or by land route. On the other side, we have the Hindus, which was, since the beginning of fourth millennium, I'd say, the main provider of hard stones and elaborated stones in antiquity. And imagine that Oman, for its geographical position, was exactly on the route from the Hindus to Mesopotamia. So for the moment, it's difficult to say, because Proto-Elamite, it's one of my kind of specialization in this context, Proto-Elamite, and it's quite short-lived, first of all, and it's also difficult to detect in Oman, because imagine in this survey we covered 3-4 millennia of history at the same time, because you travel to an area and you have a second millennium occupation. You travel to another spot and there you have some first or even later, for example. But yeah, it would be nice to find some kind of connection with Proto-Elamite, because geographically they just fronting each other on the two sides of the Gulf. And it would also be interesting because with Proto-Elamite, the questions of mobility is something that in the last year has been recognized, but is still difficult to verify or confirm and to study. But it also would be interesting to see which kind of relation in this adaptive way through mobility you can compare between Iran and Oman at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping you can speak a little bit more about your public education goals with this. You mentioned wanting to make your analysis and these pottery sherds available to the public and for people to take a look at and get a sense of the history of this site. What does that entail for you, and how involved would you be in that process of displaying for the public?
Well, this is something I still don't know, but we started this collaboration in Oman with the ministry, and they seemed quite positive when I made this proposal, because it was something that they're also searching to. I mean, since the beginning they were quite friendly. They also used in a way directly our maps, our data, our new data, because they were integrated immediately in their own proper database, so to map the land. So in this case, when we would receive a go for this kind of project, then it would actually mean being there for some months of the year and probably going in the storerooms, select what's the most important for every single period, or according to how you want to build up this hypothetical storeroom, and let's say put on display what is the most useful thing for students when they have to make comparison and when they want to specialize in the archaeology of Oman, especially because they're being in the same storeroom where all the materials from the excavation and all the teams that are working there are. It's also easier from the point of view of comparisons. You see something and you can directly go and pick it up over there in the storeroom, and so you have a direct feedback on the material, let's say.
That's always incredibly helpful, I think, as a researcher, but also just as someone who might be interested in the topic.
Yeah, for that, exactly that was the idea.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit then about how this project in particular fits in with your larger research goals and the other research that you're carrying out throughout the year?
Well, let's say mainly it's connected to the fact that I would be in a way directing the field operations for this new project. So there's a director, and I would be directing what's happening on the field mainly. And more generally, it connects to my long-time interest in mobility, as I said, and in pastoral structures, more generally, social pastoral structures, because I analyze them in the many years I was working in Iraq, for example, in the northeast of Iraq, in Kurdistan, where still today mobility represents one of the most important social architecture, I'd say, compared to what you find in the bigger cities of Kurdistan, for example. And connected also to the question made before, it also connects to the a more general project in which it would be nice finally to have a sort of database in which all the different types of mobility we encounter in the Middle East are in a way cataloged and are free accessible, for example. Because if you compare what's happening on the Levant, so on the Mediterranean side, we are sure we have forms of mobility, but in some way they are completely different from what you find up the mountains of Kurdistan or down in Oman. And this would be also nice to understand, because we don't know much about how mobility was working during this period. Sometimes we can recognize it, as I was saying, through material analysis. We find something there which can be compared to something else we have seen, 1,000 kilometers away. But then in the end, there's not a proper theory trying to mesh all together the various information which are scattered all around. That's the main point.
That's incredibly fascinating.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. Is there any final thing that no one asked you about that you wanted to make sure the audience got to hear?
I think that's enough, I guess.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for talking with us.
You're welcome. Welcome.
For folks watching, we'll be back at about 2:30 for our final interview of the day. Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We've got one more interview for you today. I'll be talking right now with Ege Dagbase. Ege, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, it's nice to be here. Thank you.
Of course. So can you start by briefly explaining to us your research interests?
Of course. I did my bachelor's in Bilkent University in Ankara in the Department of Archaeology, and participated in several different excavations, surveys, and museum practices. However, When I was in my second year summer, when I was in Kaman Kalehuyuk excavations, I was lucky enough to get a Hittite tablet from my trench. And yeah, from that moment onwards, my interests moved into a bit into the Hittite state itself and the language as well, actually. And from that moment onwards, I had a lot of Hittite classes and everything. And right now I am doing my PhD in Würzburg University in the Ancient Near Eastern Studies department. And I mainly work on the concepts of foreignness, enmity, and the perceptions of the Hittites towards the others, towards the people who don't consider themselves as Hittites. And right now in my PhD, I'm working on the Hittite Old Kingdom and how the kings and the states perceived their neighbors and their surrounding states, and if they like perceive them as enemies or rivals or friends even. So I'm more into international relations of the Hittite state in the late Bronze Age.
That's very cool. Some ancient international relations.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, then, what are your plans for this summer, and how can HAPS funding help you out?
Well, for my summer plans, I am planning to attend this survey project that we started, I think, 3 years ago. This will be the third and final season. And the main objective of the survey will be trying to understand the western border of the Hittite states. Because in the ancient times, we don't have this concept of clear borders as we do have today right now. And identifying the border is quite challenging. Specifically in the Hittite case, when we have upper land and the lower land, which is upper land in a bit more northeast and lower land a bit to the south, the western coast is a more questionable region. And what we are trying to do is to get these pottery analysis that we're like, when we're wandering around the Polatlı, which is a province in Ankara, fields, we try to gather up the potteries and lithics as well, if we can find, and try to compare them with the Hittite capital Hattusha. And if they're like more related, then we can say this region, this specific region, is more into Hittite control than the other ones. And we're trying to understand the local communities, like how they react to the Hittite state. Were they like more suppressive or more like rebellious? And however they felt. We're trying to understand that from the archaeological evidence, because in the textual records we know that the Hittites definitely had gone to even the western coasts of Anatolia. So towards the western central Anatolia, we're trying to understand this concept of the state, how it is related into this common folk. And I would use the fund for mainly sustaining myself. And since I'm in Germany right now, I need to get an accommodation in Turkey and try to do my transportation as well. But apart from that, if we can find something like more interesting, some like very distinct potteries, the lab analysis will also cost, of course. So that will also be helpful. And my main interest and trying to hope what we're trying to get is actually, if we're super lucky enough, we can maybe perhaps get some Anatolian hieroglyphs around the fields, because that happened before for different surveys. And if we can do it, I will be with some help, of course, be the philologist, of course, as well in the field for that, both with Hittite cuneiform if we can find as well.
That's incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
So we have some questions from the audience, and I have some questions too to throw at you. I hope you're ready for these. Yeah. Are there any written records that identify the extent of Hittite control, or are you entirely reliant on archaeological evidence? If there are written accounts, do they match with the archaeological data?
that's exactly what we're trying to get, because with the written record, we do know that the Hittites had some contacts towards the western coast, even to the islands of Aegean, and but they did not really control the region. Like, they had some contacts, but they did not control entirely. So we're trying to understand at what point they stopped controlling and contacted these different states in the western coast.
That's it's always exciting when you can find written textual evidence and archaeological evidence that match up.
Yeah, when they match up, of course, it's helping a lot.
Can you talk a little bit about the other cultures at play here? Who does the Hittite kingdom share that border with, and what were some of the other powerful cultures that might have been in control of that area?
Well, the western coast is actually very like a kind of a patchwork. There are like different many states, and most of them are also controlled as a vassal state from the Hittite perspective, depending on the time, of course. And they sometimes like collaborated with each other and tried to like resist towards the Hittite Empire specifically when it is more powerful, because they did not probably want to like fight one by one, but they wanted to get a confederation or something like that. But the exact region that I'm working on, which is Polatlı on the western coast of modern Ankara province, is less likely to be controlled by a specific state, like a powerful specific state. So definitely there were like many people who were living there, and because we also see it from the archaeological evidence and materials that we find. But at this point, that east, when you're considering from the western perspective, that east in the Polatlı region, there are not many powerful states.
Interesting. We have another question from the audience. Is the Hittite notion of the other a primarily military concept, or is it religious or cultural as well?
Oh, no, definitely not militaristic only, because Hittite state itself is also a multicultural state. There are different kind of people living there. And even though when we say the Hittite as the language that the state is producing the tablets, the most of the people were actually speakers of Luwian, a sister language to the Hittite. And we are pretty sure that they are not considered as others, for instance, when they're not even speaking Hittite. But of course, like speaking a language and being a part of a country is a different things. So when we're looking at the people of Hatti, we can say they're like many different languages, religions, and cultural elements within it. But when I'm talking about the others, I was more referring to the different states and polities. For instance, northeast of Hatti, which is called Atsi Hayasa, two different states, Atsi and Hayasa, but when they were quite together in a sense of defensive confederation again, and they were definitely perceived as different from the people of Hatti. And exactly we're trying to get the same notion with the western coast, western border.
How do you what sort of evidence supports that? How do you identify like cultural belonging or otherness or foreignness from an archaeological record?
From an archaeological record, that's quite hard. Yeah, I was going to tell more textual evidence, but
well, please give us that too.
Oh, okay. So when we're looking at the textual evidence, we understand that like there are some words to describe others, and again, with the same example I can give on the northeast, the land of the northeast was called barbaric and more other again towards the Hittite customs and traditions. And in the archaeological record, it is quite hard to get that, because we can get like more different potteries when they're using more different lithic tools and everything. But that doesn't mean that they're different for sure. They can still be using their own materials, but they can be a part of the Hittite state as well. We cannot say about that. So if there's like a very distinct, very specific distinction, we can at least say this local people are using a different kind of culture, different kind of like production system. So at this point, maybe they can be perceiving themselves as a bit different than the Hittites as well. So
yeah, I think that self-identity is always incredibly
exactly.
important. Yeah. And again, much easier through the textual record than the archaeological one.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about what establishing the sort of boundary of Hittite rule or influence would get the field as far as scholarship is concerned? Is it important to establish how far that boundary reaches for other types of research?
Well, what we know about the borders, especially like I'm not talking about the western border right now, but like the other borders. In some cases, we have these Luwian inscriptions and like some rock monuments stating that this is the land of Hatti and the rest of it is not. And identifying these borders can help us understand more like what was the geographical limit that this state had, because like it was one of the first powerful states in Anatolia, and like how far that they could like expand themselves is also like telling us some information about the state as well, like how powerful and how big it is.
Yeah, absolutely. This is maybe a silly question, but can you tell us a little bit more about that first Hittite tablet that you found? Were you able to translate then the very first one that set you down this path?
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't translate it at all, but because I didn't know any Hittite at that moment. But I was just lucky enough, I guess, because it was, I think, the first tablet ever found in Kaman Kalehuyuk excavations. And I was lucky enough to be in that trench as well when the discovery was happening. And that was really interesting because that is the first time that you're getting your hands into this like uniform script, and you don't understand anything. It's just like some scratches at that point. But later on, it was surprisingly easy to read. Like when I get to the lessons and the language, since the Hittite language is right now the oldest Indo-European language, it is quite easy to translate and understand the grammar as well. So
that's nice. You were able to draw on your knowledge of later Indo-European languages to help with that. Do you remember anything about like what the content was? Was it just like a letter or a bureaucratic document?
I believe there was a bird, and Mark Whedon, an important philologist in Hittite studies, invited there to translate it, and he was giving us a lecture about that. Like there was a bird, and I think it was some kind of a ritual tablet. It must be. There was some happy. Now that I know a bit more rituals, maybe that can be some like Hurrian bird rituals. I'm not really sure, but I think Kaman Kalehuyuk is a bit more into Central Anatolia than to be in a Hurrian state, of course. But maybe it can be like traded or imported or somehow like landed up there. Yeah.
Sure. We know there's tons of circulation of knowledge and culture.
Of course, yeah.
So what are your plans then following this summer?
First of all, this season is very important because I want to get to know how this survey system ends, because this will be the last season. Because at that time, like when I was first entering it, I was trying to understand the survey system very well, because I want to get my own survey into the northeastern lands again, when these lands were called barbaric and different than the Hittite culture. So, and it is quite understudied northeast as well. And when we are done with the western border, I will continue to the northeast. I'm more into the edges of the state. Like I'm trying to understand the concept from outside, and then I can move into inside. Yeah. So again, I will be working on foreignness and enmity and concepts of otherness within the state and outside of the state.
That's exciting. That's it's such an interesting concept to talk about the borders and the peripheries of these cultures, because so much interesting stuff is happening there.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this project with us and for sharing your research with us, Ege.
Thank you.
Yeah. For those of you who are tuning in, this was our final interview for today. But don't worry, if you want to hear more about the cool research that's happening in the fields of the ancient Near East and archaeology and the Hebrew Bible, tune in next week. We'll be doing another round of interviews on the 14th of May. So tune in then. And thanks for tuning in today. And thanks for all of your questions.